Last year, during my senior year of college, I was dating a guy named Daryl. Between the spring and fall semesters, I would typically visit my parents during Christmas. However, that year they were traveling out of state, and I didn't want to go that far. Daryl invited me to spend Christmas with his family, and I agreed. His parents lived in a remote countryside area, far from anything I was familiar with. When we arrived, I was struck by how isolated their small cottage was, surrounded by snow and empty fields. When Daryl's parents came out to greet us, their warm smiles faded upon seeing me. It became clear that they didn't expect Daryl to bring home an interracial girlfriend. I decided to stay optimistic, hoping to make a good impression. The evening seemed fine at first, cozy and festive. We had dinner and tried to engage in polite conversation, but I couldn't ignore their disapproving glances. Later, I was asked to do the dishes, which felt odd for a guest, but I complied. Things only got worse. They insisted Daryl and I sleep in separate rooms, citing their moral beliefs about unmarried couples. It felt more like an attempt to unsettle me. As I prepared for bed, I noticed none of the interior doors had locks, which made me uneasy. That night, I heard footsteps outside my door, pausing just outside as if someone was watching through the slats. Too scared to investigate, I tried to ignore it and get some sleep. Christmas Day was no better. Daryl's dad barged into the bathroom while I was using it, muttering an insincere apology before walking off. By nighttime, I again heard footsteps near my door. This time, I opened it and there stood Daryl's dad, completely naked. Horrified, I slammed the door and screamed. Daryl claimed his dad was sleepwalking, but I wasn't convinced. I called my mom the next morning to come get me. Daryl refused to leave with me, so I left alone. Needless to say, we broke up shortly after. The experience left me shaken. Even after the breakup, Daryl wouldn't leave me alone, calling and showing up at my door until I threatened to file a restraining order. Looking back, I know I dodged a bullet. I couldn't shake off the events of that night. Even days later, I kept replaying every detail in my mind. The way Daryl's parents acted, the eerie feeling of being watched, and the horrifying moment of confronting his dad at my door, it all felt surreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. When I returned home, I thought I could put it all behind me, but strange things started happening. It began with anonymous calls to my phone, always from an unknown number. At first, I ignored them, assuming they were telemarketers or wrong numbers. But when I finally picked up one of the calls, all I heard was heavy breathing before the line went dead. Then, one night, as I was lying in bed, I heard faint tapping at my window. My heart pounded as I froze, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or a tree branch. But the taps were rhythmic, deliberate. Slowly, I got up and moved toward the window. The curtains were drawn, and I hesitated, not wanting to see what or who was outside. Finally, gathering my courage, I pulled the curtain aside. Nothing. Just darkness. I tried to shake it off as paranoia, but it didn't stop. The calls became more frequent, the tapping continued, and soon I began to feel like I was being followed. One evening, while walking home from work, I had the eerie sensation of being watched. Glancing over my shoulder, I thought I saw a figure duck behind a tree. I quickened my pace, my heart racing, and practically ran the rest of the way home. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and turned on every light in the house. I tried to call a friend for comfort, but before I could finish dialing, my phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. The message read, "You can't escape us." I dropped my phone, the screen shattering as it hit the floor. My breath came in shallow gasps as I backed away from the phone, unsure of what to do. I knew I had to act. The next morning, I went to the police to file a report, but without solid evidence, there wasn't much they could do. The officer suggested I install security cameras around my apartment and be vigilant. That night, I set up cameras and stayed up watching the live feed on my laptop, determined to catch whoever was tormenting me. Hours passed without incident, and I began to wonder if I was overreacting. Just as I was about to turn in for the night, a motion alert popped up on my screen. I stared at the video feed in horror. Standing just outside my apartment window was a shadowy figure. They wore a mask that looked like it was carved from wood, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the screen. The figure raised a hand and tapped on the glass once, twice, 3 times, before disappearing into the darkness. I called the police again, my voice trembling as I explained what I saw. By the time they arrived, the figure was long gone, leaving no trace behind. I don't know who or what is after me. But I know one thing, I'll never feel safe again. After the police left that night, I sat in my living room, too terrified to sleep. My mind raced with questions. Who was that figure? Why were they targeting me? And most importantly, how did they know where I lived? I couldn't stay in my apartment. It was no longer a safe place. So, I packed a bag and decided to stay at a hotel for a few days while I figured out my next steps. I chose a small, nondescript hotel on the outskirts of town, hoping to stay off the radar. For the first night, things seemed calm. The silence felt almost unnatural after the chaos of the past few days. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I began to hear faint whispers. At first, I thought it was the air conditioning or maybe voices from the hallway. But the whispers grew louder, clearer. They weren't coming from outside. They were inside the room. I bolted upright, scanning the dimly lit room for the source of the sound. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light swept across the room, revealing nothing unusual. But the whispers didn't stop. You can't hide. The words were unmistakable now, echoing through the room like a sinister chant. I froze, unable to move or think, until suddenly the light in the room flickered and went out. Complete darkness. I fumbled with my phone, trying to call for help, but the screen displayed a chilling message. We warned you. Then, the phone died. I could feel the presence before I saw it. A cold, suffocating air filled the room, and I knew I wasn't alone. Slowly, I turned toward the corner of the room, where the darkness seemed to deepen, swallowing all light. From the shadows, the figure emerged. The same wooden mask, the hollow eyes, the deliberate movements. It stepped closer, the sound of its footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the small room. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. My body felt paralyzed, as though some unseen force was holding me in place. The figure raised its hand, pointing directly at me. You shouldn't have ignored the warning, it said, its voice a low, guttural growl. Before I could react, everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying in my apartment. The sunlight streaming through the windows felt almost blinding. For a moment, I thought it was all a nightmare. But as I sat up, I saw something on the floor by my bed. It was the mask. The wooden mask, with its hollow, soulless eyes, stared back at me. A single note was tucked inside it. With trembling hands, I picked it up and read the words written in jagged, uneven letters. This isn't over. I knew then that I could never escape. They weren't just following me, they were everywhere. Watching. Waiting. And there was nothing I could do to stop them.